pronouncing my own name that good in English, but thank you for that warm intro. So we founded an AI startup together. Our startup is still small. We need to ship fast. We break things. The remote works most of the time. The backend develops API endpoint as fast as possible. We have a deadline coming up. The front end hacks around the backend's inconsistencies, gets all the data it needs, and just presents a dashboard, a beautiful dashboard, an AI dashboard, not just any dashboard. It's not great, but it works because they sit next to each other and they can communicate. Suddenly, the product manager appears and he says, guys, we already have an API. Let's just make it public. The clients are already waiting for it. This is when we panic, because we did not design our API as a product meant for users. We just created endpoints that serve our own front end. And the result? Well, your API is bad and you should feel bad about it. So before we continue, let me introduce myself. I am Doron. I've been coding for almost 20 years and have developed many, many bad APIs, trust me. I'm currently VP Engineering at Longevitix, and this is my family. Let's dive in. What exactly do I mean by a bad API? Well, let me give you a couple of examples, just so we're on the same page. You're using wrong HTTP verbs. You're using wrong HTTP statuses. I think I'm going to stand closer to the remote. You have inconsistent casing. Sometimes it's just too nested, right? Technically, it is RESTful, but nobody likes this. Sometimes you're overfetching. You get the entity and the related entities and its related entities, and it's just a big request that doesn't serve what the product actually needs. This one is very important and is hard to spot live. You design your API more like limitations of the framework that you use rather than business transactions. Nobody expects front-end to orchestrate 4 requests in a row just to achieve one business transaction. Sometimes you just tailor whatever the front-end needs today to ship, and your API kind of loses meaning as its own product. Sometimes you full-on invent your own query language, nobody understands, and even you forget after a while. Don't worry, I eventually deleted that. So why did we develop a bad API? This happens not because the developers are bad. Most of the time, it happens because the process of developing the API was broken. We tend to go code first because we rush to deliver. And we don't really like planning, right? We like coding. Eventually, our API looks like the technical shortcuts that we made or limitations of the framework or whatever was shortest at the time. And as most software problems, it only gets worse with scale. I really like that some of them don't have eyeglasses. I left it on purpose. You should treat your API as a product because it has users and they deserve good UX when using it. We should design APIs the same way we design any other product. Start with the user experience, put yourself in their shoes. And what are the benefits we get when we go the design-first route? Before coding, we just think about it for a second. We get much better consistency, right? Because we plan it. We are much more likely to be consistent and use the same kind of language, the same style. Same goes for usability. Obviously, if you plan, you can think about usability ahead of time, and it's more likely to be better. You can also collaborate with other stakeholders in your organization, right? You can show them what you're planning to do, and you can catch bad ideas not only before they get to production, but even before you start working on them. And you can work in parallel. You can agree on a contract, right? Kind of sign it, let's say, and then frontend can start developing with mocks. API can start being developed, logically, and even a QA engineer can write integration tests for it. And you meet in the middle because you agreed on a contract. Now, that sounds great, but as we know, there are no silver bullets. There are only trade-offs that we take, right? And what are we trading here? Well, planning your API does slow you down at first. So if you're two guys in a garage building an MVP, it's probably not worth it because you don't really know how your product is going to look next week, and it changes fast. But when is design first worth it to you? When you have a public-facing API, I think that's a must, right? Because your API is the product people are using. It's your face, basically. You know what? I can even narrow it down to if there is another team other than the one team using this API, then you should probably go the design first route. It could be even an internal microservice, but other teams are relying on it. Or if you expect rapid growth in developers and you want to kind of limit the amount of chaos you're going to get. And luckily for us, there's already a standard for designing APIs before we develop them. We don't really need to reinvent the wheel here. Sorry, it takes some time to load sometime. Okay, great. ChatGPT told me you're going to love this joke. So, OpenAPI is definitely not new. Thank you, Ben, for laughing at my joke. And I love it. You know what? OpenAPI is just great, right? It's awesome. There's nothing bad with it. Well, it does force you between having a huge YAML or splitting it with refs. And I don't really like choosing between two bad things. Those are the hardest choices to make. Other than that, it is great. Well, a good IDE support might be nice. Yeah. Today we need much more icons in this image. And maybe a way to share standards across teams, right? Because if the API gets bigger and more than one team develops it, you want it to stay consistent and to share standards instead of everyone inventing their own way to paginate, for example. Other than that, OpenAPI is just perfect. Until you have some typo you can't find and you spend an hour and you go crazy. So OpenAPI has bad developer experience. It is a tool used for API design. It has been one way or another like the de facto standard to do it for years. But it has a steep learning curve and a bad experience overall. What we want is the VS Code experience. What we get is more the Jira experience. TypeSpec was designed just for that. TypeSpec basically is an open source by Microsoft. They are using it internally in their Azure teams and Azure APIs, so you can know it's well supported and battle tested. They also use it to flex that their Azure API is one of the biggest APIs ever, and if it's good for them, it's good for your tiny API. But what is the promise of TypeSpec? What do we get? It is inspired by TypeScript. Did I say TypeSpec before? It's saying OpenAPI and TypeSpec when all you use all day is OpenAI and TypeScript is hard. It is inspired by TypeScript, which is, for me, a good thing. I like TypeScript. I like types. It has good IDE support, especially if you're using VS Code or one of its million forks. It can emit OpenAPI specs, right? It emits Swagger or OpenAPI, but it also can emit gRPC, depends on what you're using. It can also emit validation schemas, JSON schema, or protobuf. The most important, in my opinion, it is reusable. You can write TypeSpec code and publish it as an NPM package, and other teams can reuse your same standards when designing their own. Other than that, it also has some code gen. You can generate SDKs, which nobody likes writing, or you can generate server code that is a bit mid and still in alpha. I wouldn't use it yet. Okay, enough talking. Let's see it in action and judge for ourselves, right? Okay, we install it with NPM, we init, we create a generic REST API. Didn't mean to offend anyone, it is what it says. Okay, we enter a project name, we choose OpenAPI, and let's open code and see what we get. First thing you can see is the TSP config YAML. This is basically a config for the compiler. Nothing interesting here. Now let's start writing our first TypeSpec API. Of course, we're going to write a pet store service, because I heard it's law that you cannot talk about Open API without having a pet store API. So let's define an enum of the pets we have. I don't know who buys the reptiles, but it's OK. Let's define the model of a pet, right? What we're going to use in our API. No, actually, I want our ID to be a UUID and not just any string. It's bad practice to just have string. So let's define a scalar. Scalar is like an alias for primitive, but with some additional properties we can put on it. Basically, our first simple reusable type. Now let's define some endpoints. Here, we obviously need to have all the CRUD endpoints and even list. You get that one for free. OK, let's focus for 1 second on the create. Right? When you create an entity, you send a pet, but you also get back a pet. Do you want our user to provide us an ID? Probably not. I want my database to generate that. We can actually handle it by visibility. Now, what we say is that this property is only available when you do reading. So when you update or create, you do not need it anymore. And if we're already here, let's add some validations. Add validations. OK, we added some validations. And maybe what is missing? Yes, an error. I know your APIs are perfect, but mine might have an error. So let's handle that. OK, we define an error. Now let's put it in the endpoints. OK, we either get back pet or an error, right? Makes sense. Look like a much better API, more detailed. Let's focus once again on the create. When you create, you do not only want to get like 200 success, 500 failure. You want a bit more finesse, right? You want something in the middle. So let's update our create. OK. OK, looking better, right? Now we can either get a created status back, just that our entity was created, or we get two different errors. Either it's a bad request error, right? Or some internal server error. That's much more detailed. It's a better API. Now, in my opinion, this looks like reusable pattern, right? So maybe we should extract it so we don't have to write it again and again. And now we have our second reusable pattern in the API. It's an alias. Basically, it's like a TypeScript type for more complex types than Scalar. And it also supports generics that for some reason Microsoft chose to call templates, but it's generics. And now let's use it in our API, our new pattern. OK, cool, looking good. We already started the foundation of our future NPM package. That's enough APIing for me. Let's see what we get. I need to compile at least once, right? OK, we'll open the YAML. We again look at the post. Looks good, not bad. By the way, I suggest in real life using better examples than this, because some contract testing libraries can reuse your examples to actually kind of automatically test your API. One question I ask myself at this point is, how do I support version 2, right? Or versioning? Do I need to have like a Git branch for that? You don't have to. You can, but you don't have to. You can use built-in internal versioning mechanism that TypeSpec has, and just declare an enum of your supported versions, or your versions, basically. And then, on a property level, you can define what changed, moved, removed, added. And when we compile that, we actually compile, and we get an output of two different files, one for each version. And I suggest, obviously, start versioning ahead of time, because then you're thinking of the future. So what are the next steps? We have TypeSpec defined for API, and my time is also nearly over. So we can take it and generate SDKs, like we said. It supports .NET, Java, Python, and TypeScript. Not bad. We can even do some server code. I wouldn't suggest using it just yet, but I hope it gets better. Other than that, because it already emits OpenAPI specs, we can basically reuse it with everything existing tooling for OpenAPI, right? Can do SDKs, server code, configure API gateways with it, use contract testing libraries, documentation, even load it into Postman. That sounds pretty good. So let's conclude. You should treat your API as a product. You should design it like one. OpenAPI specs works as a format. We like it as a format. But it actually has a bad experience. TypeSpec tries to solve it by just being better. Yeah. And, well, you shouldn't count on AI for jokes. Thank you very much. I've been Doron. This is my dog, Anna. Thank you.